Hello, and welcome back to Ask a News Worker. In this video, we're going to talk about confusion. Is the news confusing sometimes? Can it confuse people? I would say yes. Can the news contradict itself? Yes. Can one news outlet put out a report, put out a news item that contradicts another news outlet's news item or another news outlet's coverage? Yes. The news is not all working together in coordination necessarily. There are many different news outlets around the world who are all operating on a different schedule with different personnel, different priorities. So there will be occasions where the news contradicts itself or is confusing, where it can seem like the coverage isn't really that coordinated. One outlet is saying one thing, another outlet is saying something different. It can definitely happen. One example of the news being confusing is that in a lot of Canadian news coverage, you will see news reports, news items on how it's very difficult to buy a house. There's a lot of coverage in Canadian newspapers, as one example, Canadian media outlets, about how buying a house is unaffordable for many people, especially younger Canadians, I guess people under 40, maybe even under 50. Housing is very expensive. It's very unaffordable. It's very difficult to get a home for a reasonable price. That's the common theme. You'll see a lot of newspaper reporting on studies or just interviews with people who are going through the phenomenon, going through the experience, lamenting how expensive everything is. But then at the same time, sometimes even in the same newspaper, the same news outlet, you'll see articles lamenting that house prices are going down. For example, right now in August 2022, there's a lot of articles in Canadian newspapers about how home prices are lower than they were recently, and there's a tone of concern in those articles too. Oh, if house prices continue to go down, then the people who own the houses won't be able to sell them for as much as they would like, and that's a problem. So somehow it's both a problem that housing is really expensive and that it's getting cheaper. How could this be? Well, it's because different people are writing different articles about different phenomena, and they're not necessarily coordinating with each other to say, hey, maybe this looks weird. Maybe it looks kind of strange that on one page we've got an article lamenting how housing is so expensive, and then on the other page we've got an article lamenting how it's too cheap now or how the price has gone down. Why does this happen? Why does this contradiction take place? Well, once again, it's because the news business is made up of many different people operating in many different methods, many different locales, doing their own thing. There's not as much coordination as you would think. That's why one outlet or multiple outlets can publish things that are very different from each other or even from previous content, because there's not a lot of oversight or coordination to say, hey, we got to make sure this all makes sense. They're just putting out basically things into the world. They're just publishing news items based on their priority that day. There's not a lot of people within the news business, or really anyone, who's thinking, how do we make all this all this stuff seem coherent? That's not really happening. There was a lot of confusion, for example, happening as well during the COVID-19 pandemic, which as of August 2022 is not quite finished, but at least in North America, where I currently am, is not quite as serious a problem as it was, say, a year ago or 2 years ago. I remember during the pandemic, one of the frustrations I had, one of the issues I had as a news worker, and even as a news reader, news consumer, is that there was a lot of contradictory information coming out about COVID, even from major health institutions, even from major governments, major industrialized developed nations and their institutions. Sometimes the Health Agency of Canada would say one thing about COVID. Sometimes the U.S. Health Agency would say something different about COVID, and there's multiple agencies within both countries that can say different things. There's local, there's provincial or statewide, there's federal. The World Health Organization would be saying different things about COVID. If you dared to look into British news, you would see that the British health authorities were saying different things. If you could speak French, you could find out that the French authorities were saying different things. If you spoke Danish, you could find out that the Danish authorities were saying different things. And yet all this was being pushed out into the same news continuum, the same news channels, all there in front of all of us. And yet a lot of readers, myself included, I'm a reader as well as a news worker, we're thinking, so who's right? If the WHO, World Health Organization, is saying one thing, and say Health Canada, Canada's main governing health body, is saying one thing, or the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the States, is saying something different, who is right? Why doesn't this all make sense? Why is this not coherent? Well, once again, it's because the news is not that coordinated. If you're looking at the news stream, if you're looking at news items floating around in the world, on the internet, elsewhere, and you're going, this doesn't really cohere with this contradicts that, how could this be? It's because all of those items were produced independently of one another, and there wasn't a lot of oversight to say, hey, let's make sure that this item doesn't quite contradict this one, because that might confuse people. There's not a lot of effort being made, and this is a problem I had with the news business, and one thing I'd like to change. There's not a lot of effort being made to coordinate information to make sure that it maybe makes sense to people, that doesn't needlessly confuse people out in the real world. When I'm doing my job as a news worker, for example, I feel it is ethical, I feel it is proper to not try to confuse people, to try to minimize confusion. I feel great pressure, I feel great weight and significance when I'm doing my job to not confuse people even more than they probably already are, because the world is a confusing place. If you've been in it long enough like I have, you'll notice that there's a lot of things that don't quite make sense. I don't want to compound that. I want to make sure that I'm as clear as I can possibly be when I'm reporting the news, but it can be very difficult because, once again, the news, as I said in another video, is often passing along word from someone else, from another institution, from the leader of a government, the leader of an organization, and what many different organizations or governments say may not completely coincide, but we in the media simply pass it along. We're the medium. We're the middle person. We are taking what people are saying and passing it along to you, the public, the readership, the viewership, the listenership, the consumer. But we realize that a lot of the times the statements won't necessarily coincide. They won't make a lot of sense next to each other, or there'll be obvious contradictions. But that's not the media's fault per se. We could do a better job of coordinating the information, once again, making sure things cohere a little better. But remember, we're basically just passing along the word from other people in many cases. And they didn't necessarily talk to each other. Health Canada and the CDC and the UK Health Office, whatever they're called, weren't necessarily talking, hey, let's make sure that we all put out a unified statement and agree completely on what we're going to say on, say, COVID or any other topic. They're not doing that. They're institutions that are operating with a lot of autonomy from each other. They put out statements that the press picks up and then distributes, and then you, the reader, you, the consumer, have to figure out, okay, so who's right? If this doesn't quite match this, or if this isn't flush with this, what's really going on here? The news is confusing because there's a lot of different people pumping messages into the news stream all day, every day, and they're not checking with each other to make sure that they're not confusing everyone. There's not a lot of effort being made to minimize confusion on, say, an executive or top level. I try to do what I can when I'm working, but it's difficult. So if you find yourself confused by the news, if you think the news is confusing sometimes, I'll read one thing that contradicts another thing or doesn't seem to fit with another thing. That's because those two items were probably made by completely different people at different times, maybe even in different parts of the world, maybe even in different language groups. There's a lot of different people, a lot of different individuals and groups in the news business who are working independent of one another. There's not a lot of coordination sometimes. So if you do find the news confusing, it's because there's not a lot of coordination to make sure that things make total sense when being presented to the public. We pass the word along from other people, and we hope you can figure it out. But a lot of the times you can't. Sometimes a news worker, even myself, will be asked like, oh, can you explain why this doesn't quite fit with this? Or can you explain what this means? And I'll say, not really, because I'm just passing on the word from someone else. You'll have to ask them directly. And that leads to another topic we'll get into another video, is there a fair feedback loop between the public and the press and the institutions that the press reports upon? And I would say no, But that's another video for another time. So is the news confusing? Yes. Why is it confusing? Because there's many different people working in it, doing different things at different times, and not talking to each other. None of this is reassuring. This might not be a very reassuring channel, but that's not the point of this channel. The point of this channel is to be honest, is to talk honestly about what the news is, how it works, and to answer your questions. Do you have any other questions about the news? Are you curious about certain things I've touched upon so far that I haven't mentioned? Please write a comment. Please send an email, and we'll continue to get into it here on Ask a News Worker. Thanks for watching.